right, everybody. Hopefully that was long enough for you to get a little quick movement in. So thank you. I think now I'm going to turn things over to Tom McDermott to introduce our next speaker.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. This is Tom McDermott, and I'd love to introduce you guys to Chris Pike, who'll be walking us through this presentation on the GASB information and some information about cloud technology. Chris, over to you.
Hey, well, thanks, Tom, and good morning, everyone. It's kind of hard to go after a presentation like that. There was a lot of great discussion and good information in there. I loved how he started off the conversation just talking about capacity, and reminds me of something I heard once that says, you know, everybody cheats. You just got to decide what you're going to cheat on. There's only so much capacity in your day. How do you balance that between work and personal and everything else going on? So great information. Really appreciate the discussion on that last topic. And I remember he was with us during my conference and was just a phenomenal speaker. I told Miller, I said, we've got to get him plugged in a little bit more. He's just a phenomenal presenter. So really good stuff. Now switching gears, I don't anticipate having the 80 plus questions that we had on that last topic. Hopefully this information will at least not put you to sleep, and maybe we'll use that to ignore some of what we heard that last hour and just take some coffee and try to stay awake during our GASB presentation. But we are today going to look at GASB 96. This just came out a couple months ago. But I think you will find that there is not a lot of new information to hear here. I think you're going to hear something that sounds awfully familiar. So we'll get into that and talk a little bit about it later as we get through the material. And then we'll spend a lot of our time talking today about why the GASB took this topic and decided to make it an issue and address it. So, we'll talk, SBITA, that's a new acronym for us. So we'll get into what that is and why GASB kind of took the bull by the horns and started talking on this topic. So we'll definitely get into that. The first thing I'd like to kind of point out is I've been presenting for GGFOA for over a decade now. And this is my first accounting and auditing topic. It's the first time I've talked about a GASB topic. And I think that's kind of interesting, and we'll see a little bit of why I took this on in a little while, but it was kind of near and dear to my heart, and it's something that I've been looking at in the industry now for many years, and I'm glad GASB is kind of catching on to some of the things that we're seeing in the governmental sector. So we'll talk a lot about that this morning as well. And so we'll kind of break this into two sections here. First, what is the GASB 96? What are SBITAs? And then why GASB is looking at that. The last thing I'd kind of point out, just to give you a little bit of lead time and advance notice on, is that in the presentations that you're able to download off of the GGFOA website, I've included a lot of supplemental information, stuff that we're probably just not going to have time for and dive into great detail on this time that we have with us this morning. But it's something that you can take away and reference later if you need to. So not so much homework, but when it gets time to implement and start looking at GASB 96 issues, you'll have something to go back on. So you'll have that material as well. If you do have questions, certainly feel free to pop them into the Q&A. I would encourage you to use the Q&A box, not the chat box. It'll be a little bit easier for us to track. Certainly you can use the chat box to shout out to a friend or anything like that, and then use the Q&A box for something directed at myself or Tom. Tom is moderating. He and I are co-workers, work for the same company, and he is a good subject matter expert on some of the information that we're going to talk about later today. And though moderating, I do think he'll probably chime in every once in a while and add some good color commentary to what we're going to be talking about. So with that, we'll just go ahead and launch our first poll question. I'd love to get some advanced notice here. Do you currently have subscription-based IT arrangements? And if you didn't pick up on that, there's our acronym, SBITA, subscription-based IT arrangements. So let's just take a couple minutes there, answer that, not a couple minutes, but about a minute or so, and just answer that question. Do you currently have any subscription-based IT arrangements? And if you
acronym
get that
within an acronym, Chris, huh?
That's right. We've got IT in there. So information technology arrangements. So if you've answered that poll question and you still got some spare time on your hands, maybe throw in the chat box what's something that you have a SBITA for.
It looks like our response has slowed down a bit, Chris. But
yeah, absolutely. So about half of us have subscription-based IT arrangements. A fourth of us, I don't know, and another fourth of us, no, we do not. So the 46% who said yes, good for you. The 25% who said no, good for you. The 29% who said, I don't know, this class is just for you. So we'll dive into this a little bit more. For everybody else, it'll be good information, and maybe your answers will change. We'll see. So first of all, let's go ahead and dive into section 1, which is just an overview of GASB 96 that was issued earlier this year. So GASB 96 did a few things. First of all, it defined what SBITA is. So for those 29% who don't know if they have a subscription-based IT arrangement or not, GASB 96 is going to tell you what that is so that you can determine whether or not you've got one. The second thing it does is it defines and establishes this right of use subscription asset. It is an intangible asset, which you would think IT, that kind of makes sense. A lot of times it's software based, which as we know is sometimes considered intangible assets. And then a corresponding liability. So a lot of times when we think about arrangements or contracts, we don't necessarily think about assets and liabilities. We think about expenses and cash flow. So this kind of shifts gears from that old mentality of a agreement or an arrangement being an expense to now it's going to correlate to a subscription-based asset and a subscription-based liability. The third thing it does is it does give us the criteria for outlaying those subscription payments. So just because it says you're going to pay $100,000 per year or $50 per year, whatever that number ends up being, that doesn't necessarily mean that's what the asset value is. So we're going to have a breakdown between the asset value and any implied or imputed interest that may be in there. And then the fourth thing it does, which GASB is always great to do, is it gives us the required note disclosures regarding this GASB statement. So in addition to the accounting position that we need to record these assets on and the liabilities as well, there's also footnote disclosures that go along with that. So item number 1, this, defining what is an SBITA or a subscription-based information technology arrangement or agreement. It's simply a contract which is going to give you the ability to use someone else's software. Now, it could be a standalone or it could be as part of some other software or hardware that you're using. It's time constrained, which means that it has a starting point and an ending point. And there is an exchange in here. So you're essentially, let's take all the legalese out, so to speak. you're basically renting someone else's software. That's what it amounts to. You have access to it for a contracted period of time, and you are paying for the use of that asset for that contracted period of time. And once that contract period expires, you would no longer have access to it. Now, when we're talking with some governments, just in my job, and I'll go around talking with some governments, I'll hear something like, oh, we've got the same finance software. We've been using this software for 30-something years. We bought it back when computers were first invented, and it still has a green screen, and this is what we've just been using for the last several decades. You bought that one time, you own that software. You may be in a situation where internally you continue to develop or improve that software over time, but you have ownership of that asset, and you're the one that will maintain it. You're the one that will make any kind of improvements on it, and you own it. That's not what this is. So that's software that you've owned a long time ago, and you will continue to own it indefinitely. Maybe there's some maintenance agreements or some support agreements or something like that, but it doesn't take away your ability to own that software. So you bought it and it's still yours. Subscription-based means there is a starting point and a stopping point in there. And again, we'll, not to get too far down the road, but we'll talk about why this is becoming more the norm rather than the exception, and why GASB is addressing that. So that term means that the government does have a non-cancelable right to use the asset. It's yours, but it's on loan. There may be some options to extend or terminate. And I know in government, for example, a lot of us will have contracts that, quote, expire at the end of each year, and then they're automatically renewed. That's not what we're really talking about. In that case, for accounting purposes, we're not really looking at that as a one-year contract. If you've got 10 automatic annual renewals, we're really looking at that as a 10-year contract, not 10 one-year contracts. So you may have an uncancelable right, or there's a significant, you can cancel at the end of each year, but there's this penalty, or you have to recoup some expenses that's been spread out, something like that. So you want to look at what is the essence, the reality of that contract, a lot more than the technical legal definition of when does it expire. Secondly is you do have the right to use that asset, and you create a subscription-based asset on your financial statements, and then there's a corresponding liability in there as well. So you debit the asset, credit the liability. Don't want to give away the answer too much, but this should be starting to sound a little familiar with something else that we've talked about recently. And then the subscription liability is initially measured at the present value. So there is an imputed or discount interest rate built into this. So just because your annual payments may be $100,000 per year for the next 10 years, that doesn't mean that that's the liability that you have. That's going to be the principal and the interest, and you're going to have to, in some cases, determine what amount of that is the liability and what amount of that is the principal, either based on a stated interest rate from the vendor or your current incremental borrowing rate. So again, some of that should be sounding very familiar. All right, subscription asset, what is the value of that asset, and also the liability for that offsets that asset. It is the payments made to the vendor before the commencement of the term, plus any kind of implementation costs you have, minus any incentives you receive from the vendor at or for commencement. Essentially, it's the total amount that you intend on paying them, less the imputed interest amount, with a few exceptions. We'll talk about some of those exceptions that do not get built into the asset price in just a little bit. So again, should start to be sounding a little bit familiar here. We'll get into a little bit more of that in just a moment. Now, next, the amortization, that's going to be our interest expense. So as I mentioned on that previous slide, we're going to back that out. And then we're going to be left with amortizing that subscription asset over the subscription term. So if you have 10 years in that contract, then you're going to be gradually reducing the asset through an amortization expense, and then also reducing the liability through the outflow resources there until the value of that asset is zero. Definitely no different than if you were buying a fire truck or a police car or a new IT system. You're going to be buying that equipment and then depreciating it over time. The same thing here. You're going to be treating this subscription asset as a capital asset and then amortizing it over the remaining term, instead of just charging the annual contracts to an expense account such as professional services or technical services or something like that. So, all right, now this chart, I like this chart. This will be a good one if you want to do a print screen real quick or go back to it later on. This really takes a lot of the entire GASB statement and boils it down into a quick little chart for you to help you determine what goes into it. So the one thing I'd like to point out, we looked at the left to the preliminary project stage. That one would be anything related to discovery. So a lot of times when we're going out and we're buying software, one of the first things we may do is pick up the phone and we start calling certain software vendors. Hey, we're looking for a new GIS system. We understand you have GIS. We're looking at upgrading our finance ERP solution. We understand you have one of those. Whatever the case may be, we'd love to kind of see what it is that you have to offer. The technology's changed a lot. Maybe we're in our previous example, we've been using the same software for the last 30 years. We don't even know what's out there. So we'd love to kind of see your product and take a look at that. Or we're thinking about going to GIS. We've heard a lot of vendors use yours, or a lot of our other governments use your vendor product. We'd like to kind of see it. So that's the preliminary stage. You're going to expense any of those costs as you incur them. They don't get capitalized. So all the effort of going in and creating the RFP, the discovery, seeing the demos before you actually select your software, all those costs get expensed. Then the second one here, the initial implementation stage, that's when you're going to get capitalized. So almost from the point of time where you decide, this is the company that we're going to go with, this is the product or the software that we're going to go with, then you're going to start tracking all of those costs as far as getting those implemented, getting those established and set up and running. What are all those costs? Those are the things that you're going to capitalize. So back to our previous slide here, the amortization, that subscription asset that you're looking at, this is this middle box here. So everything associated with getting that up and running. And then this third box here, we haven't really hit on much yet, but this would be any kind of operational or additional implementation stage. Normally you will expense these. So this could be something like support agreements or just regular maintenance costs that you may have associated with it, some ongoing training costs, etc. You're going to normally expense those as you incur them, but you could need to capitalize them. So capitalize if specific criteria is met. That's what you see right here. Think about this one is not unlike a building improvement or an infrastructure improvement that you might have. If you substantially alter the software, create some additional functionality that goes with it, or significantly extends the life of that agreement, then that's going to be a situation where you're going to capitalize those costs. Otherwise, most of the time you're just going to expense those as you incur. So any kind of, new employee training, here, welcome to the city of XYZ. We're glad to have you on board. Sit down here at this computer and watch this training module that we've created that's going to teach you about the software. Those kind of costs you're going to be expensing as you incur, which will take us to our next slide here. Training costs should always be expensed, regardless of the stage. And if we flip back real quick, this right here, this implementation, been a huge proponent for years that our biggest failure with software implementation isn't with the software itself, it's with the training that's involved with it. So most of the time when we buy software for an intended purpose, it's going to do what that purpose is. Where we kind of miss the boat is that we don't get adequately trained in how to use that software. And then another problem that we have with software performance is that, I call 80% rule. So when you first buy software and the software company is on site training you on how to do something, you learn 80% of what it is that you need to really know. And then the next person that you train, they learn 80% of what you just taught them. So now they know 64% of what the first trainer did. And then when they train that next person, then they're down to about half of what the system can do, just going that 2 generations down. So if we think about that software that we've been using for 30 years, there's a good chance that that software can do a ton of stuff that we just don't utilize anymore, or it's just simply been outdated. But a lot of the time we've lost through the training. So I've always thought that a huge component of getting new software should be heavily invested in the training aspect of it to make sure people understand what it is that the software can do. So that would fall into this initial implementation stage. But as we've noticed in the GASB statement, those training costs should always be expensed, regardless of the stage in which they have occurred. So with that in mind, we kind of have to start shifting our mindset a little bit. And I made kind of the side note, this isn't going to be in the GASB statement anywhere, but I think we do ourselves a lot of good if we start working with our purchasing departments a little bit better, so that we can see the various components, how much of this is development, how much of this is testing, how much of this is training. Because if we're going to need to break out those training costs, then we really need to have them broken out in our contracts as well, so that we can know this is how much it's amortized over the life of the asset. This is how much we can expense right away. Another thing, and this is kind of bonus material, I don't even have a slide for this, but I remember going through different financing needs. And we had a situation once where the police chief came to me and said, Georgia Power would like to install cameras at our various intersections on their utility poles, and they're not going to charge us for the equipment. Instead, they're going to charge us X number of dollars per year, and we would do a 10-year contract. And at the time, my immediate thought was, okay, that's going to be an expense because we don't own the asset and we're not responsible for the maintenance of the equipment, the cameras at all. So this is going to be an expense, not an asset. And the tricky part was he had capital dollars that he could spend. There was legal restrictions that it had to be for capital. but he couldn't use those funds for that purpose because at the time that would have been considered an expense. Now, I kind of wonder if the same question was presented, if we would have a different solution. In this case, now we're creating an asset, and that's capital. So if we are having this amortizable asset on the books, maybe we can start using those dollars that are restricted to capital, such as maybe SPLOST, for example, could be capital specific, but a software agreement in the past would be expense, and you kind of wonder whether or not we can do that. I think now you've got a little bit more justification to do something like that. Now, I'm not your lawyer. I'm not your city attorney, your county attorney, or anything like that. So you always want to fall back on what they state, but at least start thinking and raising the question, this is no longer an expense. This is now an asset. Maybe the funding sources can change too, and you can amortize that asset over the life of the agreement, and maybe your financing can be coming from different sources rather than just your normal O&M budgets. So start thinking about that a little bit as well too, and answering some of those questions. All right. So there's some, I just don't want to dive too far into this, but I do want to, if these apply to you, you may want to refer specifically to the GASB guidance specifically. So what do you do if there's multiple components? What if you do, what if, you know, there is an exception if the agreement is 12 months or less. So, you know, logically speaking, if there's not an exception, you set it up as an asset and then you amortize everything in 1 year. That's really no different than just expensing it. So they built in that exception to kind of help you with that. And then some of the disclosure requirements that you need to allocate those expenses. Next, you're going to recognize and measure the asset and liability based on what you understand to be true at the beginning of the year that you're implementing. So best information you have at the time. If it ends up being something different and you go back and say, why did we ever do it that way? Well, maybe the answer is, well, at the time we thought this and that changed. So you want to not really account for every possible scenario, but rather what do we think is going to happen right now? So that's certainly good to kind of keep in mind as well. You are permitted, but you're not required to. You can include those capitalized outlays associated with some of the initial implementation stage and some of those costs incurred prior to implementing on the subscription asset at the adoption. I kind of think that's a little overkill, especially as far as keeping up with the information, but maybe there's a financing reason for doing so. And if you can include more of the costs into the financing of the project, that there's a different funding source. So maybe in a situation like that, you may want to rethink what cost that you're picking up there. That brings me to the question that I have for you, not a polling question yet, but does this sound familiar? You know, I've talked a lot about the right of use asset and amortizing it over the life of the agreement. You know, do those things kind of make sense? Does it sound like something you've been hearing for a while? You got a yes from the crowd. So that will bring us to the poll question. Does this sound like something you've heard before? What older GASB statement does this sound like? Are we talking about some OPEB costs, which would be statement 74 and 75? Does this sound a little bit about leases, which was in 87? Or maybe it sounds like 89, accounting for interest costs before the end of a construction period. Or no, this sounds very new to me. I don't think I've heard any of this before. Just kind of take your pick there. The nice thing about poll questions is you just have to answer them. You don't even have to get them right when you're in online training classes. So if you're not sure, take a wild guess, and whatever it is, you'll still get credit for the class.
Yeah, while that question's going through, Chris, a lot of times what I hear on my side of things from some of the consultants when they're going through and putting together like an RFP for new technology is they use the term leasing of the software, which is very similar to you use the word renting. So,
Mhm.
basically side by side. And then the other piece of it is if you guys are in a cloud technology system, you still own the data in terms of you can always export it out into a new system if even if you don't own the software, you still own your data within it. So I thought that was important to clarify as well.
Good point. And if y'all were paying attention, he kind of gave you a hint there. Now, if you're reading the chat box, Lori's just told you the answer. So that's always the easiest one to go. And yeah, so half of you picked up immediately. Yeah, this sounds like leases. And then a fourth of you said, no, this sounds kind of new. So good in both cases. Definitely GASB 87. There is almost nothing different about this GASB statement than GASB 87. And the question is, well, why didn't they just address it in 87? Well, they probably didn't think about it. They probably could have done it a little bit differently. And then in the process of adopting 87, they started hearing comments, well, what about this? What about that? And they say, you're right. There's really not a lot of difference. So GASB didn't spend a whole lot of time on 96 like they did on 87 because a lot of the legwork had already been done. Now, given the fact that it is very familiar with something that we're already doing starting this year with leases, this past year rather, takes me to my question, what's the effective date? Well, if you read the GASB statement, you're looking at 2023, so 3 years down the road. 87 had a big planning stage as well. I think anybody who's been in any kind of continuing education conference settings for the last 4 years has heard GASB 87 over and over and over again. In fact, for my conference that I have in the springtime, I specifically told the instructors, I do not want to hear GASB 87. I've heard it so many times already. Let's don't do it anymore. So with GASB 96, we've got that same 3-year horizon to plan for it. But as with most GASB statements, you can implement early. And that's the one I want to try to get you to think about is why not? If we're already doing GASB 87 for leases, then our accounting systems and our training and our mindset is already geared towards this right of use concept with the imputed interest and the amortizing costs and everything else. There's no change that we have to do to bring on GASB 96. So rather than waiting until 2023, we could just go ahead and start doing it that way. And we can change our policy and procedures internally to where everywhere it says leases, just go ahead and change that leases and software-based agreements. You could very easily do something like that, would not require a lot of adjustment or changes at all on your end. And I think you can, with very little impact to your operations, go ahead and implement 96 today. Now, the exceptions, yeah, absolutely. So if you don't have any leases that you've set up as a right of use asset, then yeah, this would be something new for you. But if you've been amortizing your leases for the last year or even 2 years, and you're seeing this GASB 96 for the first time, don't be afraid of it. And I would even argue, don't wait. Just go ahead and implement it now. And I think you'll save yourself some trouble down the road having to do that. Especially given what I was saying before about the ability to finance an asset differently. You may have non-accounting purposes for kind of implementing that sooner rather than later. So that really wraps up the first part, the first segment of our presentation. And what I'd like to get to now is why GASB is addressing this. So what are some examples of software or subscription-based IT arrangements? Back to our first polling question, 29% of you said, I don't know if I have this or not. 25% said no, and there's probably a good chance that many of those were a yes. So let's look at why GASB is addressing this and just how much subscription-based IT arrangements have really started to get into the governmental sector. So here we go. We got some examples that we have in place. So Esri, everybody on your screen, you should have the ability to kind of raise your hand. Raise your hand if you use Esri for your GIS system. Look at that. They're just popping up. So your GIS department uses Esri. That is a subscription-based IT arrangement. You run on their platform, their software. It's cloud-based. So it's not something that you downloaded and installed on your computers. It's a system that you're using theirs. So several dozen of you said, yes, we use Esri. What about Office 365? Another show of hands. Who's using Office 365 right now? That one's popping up a lot faster. 3 dozen, 4 dozen. Yeah, so a great many of you. So certainly a lot there, and you can put your hands back down. So if you're using Esri or you're using Office 365, you're using subscription-based IT arrangements. So there's a lot of others here on the screen that you see if you have an Oracle, a NetSuite system or Microsoft Outlook, some of the Google Gmail products that are, not personal Gmail accounts, but some of the corporate ones that are out there. Anybody using DocuSign right now for their transactions? Show of hands on that one. A few hands popping up. More than I would have thought, but yes, a lot of companies now are sending out employment agreements or W-9s and I-9s and W-4s and that sort of thing, and using DocuSign. So these are all examples of subscription-based IT arrangements. So what are some of the advantages of these software-based arrangements? I think first and foremost, our demands are changing and evolving constantly. That last presentation that we had, and again, Matt's fantastic. I thoroughly enjoyed hearing him speak. But he showed one slide up that said in 2008, on average, we had 1 hour of screen time. And in 2020, we had 3 hours of screen time. What happened in 2007 that changed everything? Anybody want to pop up in the chat box here? Some invention or new technology that came about? And there you go, Rachel. She got it right off the bat. Yes, the iPhone came out in 2007. That changed everything. In 2007, I didn't have a company phone that was issued by my government. I had a personal cell phone. Anybody remember the days where you paid for your minutes? And they weren't cheap. It was like 59 cents per minute or something like that. We didn't talk on our phones nearly as much. How about the days of texting where you had to pay 50 cents or even $1 per text? Then it got down to 10 cents per text. iPhones changed a lot of that. And then, of course, Samsung and some of the Droid products were quick to catch up with that. But if we look at the last decade, the demands of government is changing tremendously. Our code enforcement departments, they're now going out into the field with iPads. Our building inspectors are now getting documents submitted electronically. They're not even getting those big rolls of plan reviews anymore. So the demands are changing. Agility is a must. We're not, and COVID, man, what a great example of agility being a must. Quick show of hands, how many of you have not worked from home in the last 6 months? All right, so 10 people. We've got a room of 160, and less than a dozen of us have not worked from home in the last month. Think about 10 years ago. Did anybody work from home 10 years ago? Show of hands on that one. Look at that, 5 people worked from home, 10. We almost pushed through that dozen mark. But again, out of 160 people, only 10 of us worked from home 10 years ago. So that has completely changed the way government's operating. You've got a 360 view. I talked about GASB 96 a couple minutes ago, thinking about this lost concept of, using lost funds or SPLOST funds to fund a capital project. We're not just thinking debits and credits anymore. How does this information impact us? What a concept. If a citizen calls the city manager to complain, the city manager can immediately pull up that customer name in your ERP solution and see anytime that you've called and talked about an issue, whether it be an invoice that's outstanding or a check they didn't receive or a code enforcement violation or an expired dog tag or whatever the case, everything's right there. The city manager or the county manager has the ability to look at that person and see, yeah, they just got a code enforcement violation because their grass is 3 feet tall and they're complaining about how unreasonable and how harsh the government is on them. And I'm looking right here, there's a picture in your ERP solution of the customer's grass that's really tall. We wouldn't think an ERP, which is debits and credits and reporting, 30 years ago would be somewhere we would go to see a picture of someone's tall grass. But now we're looking at things differently with this 360-degree view of getting more value out of our data. Again, back to this first point, because the demands are so evolving. New technology impacts expectations. We can do more. And governments have always had the ability, have had the tendency of playing catch up when it comes to technology. But if we look into the private sector and see just how citizens are using technology, this Zoom session, for example, here's another great question. Let's see with our hands up here. How many of you have had your legislative body, so your city council or county boards, how many of y'all have had a Zoom city council meeting or county commission meeting? Look at that. Look at those numbers go up. So I saw as high as 55. So you can put your hands back down. So a third of you have had Zoom, I will say WebEx, Zoom, any of those platforms, those kind of council meetings. Now, second part of that question, a year ago, how many of y'all would still say that's the same thing? A year ago, we have had a city council or a city commission meeting via Zoom or WebEx or something like that. Look at that, Tom. One hand goes up.
Let's talk to that person. Yeah.
So tell me technology has not impacted your expectations, which brings you to that next point. Real-time employee constituent engagement is essential. So GASB's addressing this from an accounting standpoint because they're seeing just how prevalent this is impacting how we're doing business today. They're seeing a lot more of these subscription-based IT arrangements, and that's why they're making it from an accounting standpoint. So a lot of things that we never thought we'd have to deal with, suddenly it's right there in our face, which really brings me to this next concept. Folks, the cloud, it's a principle, it's not a software version. Back in 2009, 2010, I had a city council member that came to me and said, we really need to be looking at getting more and more of our software on the cloud. And I didn't know what the cloud was. It's those white puffy things up in the sky, right? So that's all I knew. So I took, it was a budget discussion. So I took the question back to our IT manager, and the IT manager said, no. cloud, it's unreliable. We can't trust it. We don't get to see and touch and hold the software. I don't like it. I don't want to use it. We don't need to do it. Now roll the clock forward 10 years, because that was almost 10 years ago. Now, there's not many of us who aren't in the cloud in some way or another. It's definitely more reliable, it's more secure, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but it just gives us greater functionality and flexibility. Anybody streaming online, any kind of entertainment platform, Netflix. Okay, here's a good show of hands. How many of you remember getting DVDs in the mail from Netflix when they first came out? And it's kind of interesting, when they first started using Netflix and were actually sending out DVDs, they interviewed the CEO, and he was talking about gradually abandoning that model. And they asked him, why would you do that? And his answer was, we're not called Netflix for nothing. We are going to be an online entertainment company. Then everybody else, has since followed. You now have HBO Max and Disney Plus and CBS All Access and Hulu and Amazon Prime and all those others is just completely different. This would be a fun question, Tom. How many of you have not bought a CD in the last 5 years?
Guilty.
Yep, guilty as well. So, we're up to a third of you. I bet that number's higher. I think somebody needs a coffee refill. I would be surprised if that number's not higher.
Maybe it was a gift. They bought it for somebody else. Yeah.
Yeah. How many of you remember, and this wasn't that long ago, how many of you remember buying iTunes gift cards so that you could download songs that you bought? That wasn't that long ago. But are we still buying songs today? I'm not. I can't remember the last time I downloaded and purchased a song. Everything's in the cloud now. We're buying these subscription platforms, and we're getting the product for us in a different way. Are we still paying for it? Absolutely. But it's a different concept. It's a principle that we're going to. And this next slide, I love putting this. Yes, David, vinyl will always be the only way to listen to music. Spot on. But for many of us in the car, that vinyl record player just doesn't work quite as well. So I love this slide. This is a good one. So when you want to say a picture tells 1,000 words, this is our 1,000 words right here. So going through this right here, mainframe applications. This is what it was like 20, 25, 30 years ago. And many of us are still running our accounting software packages and other software packages using these mainframe applications. Then in the evolutionary world, we struck oil. So we started seeing some Windows-based client server applications. Then it kind of quickly moved. And I would say this was more in the last decade or so, we started getting this, what I like to call fake cloud. They're browser-based, so it looks like you're logging on, but it's really just hosted. It's on someone else's system. You're just accessing it through an internet or a browser-based application. And then really what we have now, and the private sector has been doing this for about 10 plus years, but you see a lot more in government now, going to true cloud. You don't own the software. You don't have access to manipulating the code or anything like that. You're truly using someone else's software to run your applications. Most of us who aren't using Office 365 at least know about it, and that's not a lot of difference than what we're talking about here. You go to a website and everything's right there. It's saving for you automatically when you make a change. When you log off, it saves your changes. You go to somebody else's computer, you log back on, boom, that spreadsheet's right there. So no matter where you're at, no matter what device you're using, you get that same thing. That's cloud technology. That's what we're looking for here. And why are we moving towards this? Well, here are some great examples. It's faster. You don't have version lock. I love this feature right here. When in the last 10 years, I won't name the software. I'm not trying to promote one software over the other. But in the last 10 years, when I was using a particular software platform, I would always complain about something, and then I would get the comment back, oh, well, that's in our next version. You'll get that in our next version. And we'd have to get on their calendar. IIT department would have to get with the software developer and say, hey, when can we get scheduled to have this new version updated in our system? With cloud technology and cloud platforms, you're always running the latest and greatest version of that software. So if you're in a cloud ERP or Office 365, you don't have to update your software. It's not, Office 2, Office 3, Office 5, there's no more. It's just 365. You've always got the current one, which really gives you a lower cost model. You have the vendor managing your updates for you, not your IT department. So, and you can access it anywhere. There's not a VPN connection. So I think, Tom, we're supposed to give away some money today. This would be a good one. Really hard question. Can someone maybe throw up in the chat box here 3 good examples on why cloud software is potentially better for you than non-cloud software? Anybody have some ideas? And a hint for you, they're right there on the screen.
I'd say give us all 3 in one chat. Oh, perfect, Kevin.
There we go. Kevin's big winner. Absolutely. I want to talk a little bit about the security in just a moment. I got to be careful and watch our time too. We're almost at the hour mark, so I know I've got about 20 minutes left here. Another example, I talked about how our people and our lives are changing outside of government. Government's got to catch up with that. Today people are social, and by that, I don't necessarily mean like social media. So, Facebook and Twitter and things like that. Yes, they are, but I mean, we're interacting more using technology. Anybody, here's a good show of hands question. Anybody, can you run your ERP solution on your iPhone? We had 5 hands up before. We still have 5 hands. Gina says yes. Okay, we got 3 more hands that popped up. So just a few of you. How many of you can order pizza on your iPhone? There we go. Big difference, right? So if I can approve the purchase of a 3-topping pizza from Domino's on my iPhone, why can't I review the documentation for an invoice and approve a vendor bill on my iPhone? There's really no reason why we can't. The technology's there. We've just got to learn how to get our current technology to catch up with what's already happening outside of our governmental software. So we need to get a little bit better on that and start looking for those opportunities. Any device, anytime, anywhere. So whether you're on an iPad or you're on iPhone, or I'm using I a lot. I think you can tell what device I use. But regardless of your smartphone, tablet, or device that you're using, you should be able to access your data anywhere, anytime. I love the idea of sitting by the pool with a drink in your hand, with your laptop booted up, working on approving a batch of vendor bills. Why do we have to be sitting behind a desk to get our job done? we really don't. And for those of you that are joining me tomorrow on the session that I'm presenting, it's called Be All You Can Be, kind of borrowing from the Army theme. We're talking about different ways that the military has changed on how they train and teach. Same concept right here. So why do we have to be sitting behind a desk in order to work? Matt, on our last presentation, he was sitting in their break room. You saw the refrigerator and the sink behind him, you know, and he was wired, he was up and running. There's no reason why we can't. So any device, anytime, anywhere. I love the anywhere component of that. Sitting by the pool, we can be working. At a parking lot when our kids are inside the dance studio and we've got 15 minutes that we're trying to kill some time, why not boot up our phone or our tablet and we can use that to get some work done that we won't have to take away from our kids later on in the night when we're trying to catch up on some stuff. So
Chris, we do have a couple of questions kind of flowing in here.
Sure.
The top one here is about what about security on personal iPhones or personal devices?
Absolutely. That's our next slide. So let's skip that one. Let's look at some of our other questions here. Our council ordinance restricts working from home or outside the office for security purposes. I've heard governments can, and again, next slide, we're going to get into that one. Governments can't legally work outside the office. Don't know if he's making a statement or a question. I will say legally kind of depends on your policy and procedures, which again, I'm going to go back to this slide right here. Are we stuck in dinosaur or do we need to move to this new paradigm? Things change. We've got to change with it. Our citizens are using this. We need to be doing so as well. Yeah, it's a mindset change, and a lot of us that are in this class right now can't make that decision, but the security part is where I love those first two questions that we got here. The great thing about cloud computing is you're going to get, with the right vendor, of course, but you're going to get so much more security than you currently have right now. You know, I kind of work with a cloud ERP solution. Ask yourself, did any of y'all have 24/7 armed guards securing your current ERP solution platform? So if you have a hosted or an on-site ERP solution, do you have an armed guard sitting outside your IT room making sure no one gets inside? Anybody want to raise their hand on that one? So there's one check mark. Manage physical access. Only the people who need to have access to the software platform are allowed in that building. Do you have a building where only people who are allowed for your ERP can get into it? Odds are no. In fact, one of the products that I work with, Oracle's NetSuite, for example, I was reading their security policy. Do you know they even dictate what kind of hedges and shrubs will be grown around the building from a landscaping standpoint, just to ensure that security isn't compromised? How many times when we're looking at installing new software or something on premise, have we taken into consideration what the landscaping is going to look like? To make sure, I mean, we're talking some high-tech stuff going on here, but low tech as well. We have the ability with cloud software. You have the natural ability to maintain servers at multiple locations around the world. In the United States, the Oracle NetSuite product that I talked about, there's 3 locations. They got one on the west, they got one on the east, they got one in the middle, where if there is a hurricane that comes through Florida and Georgia and knocks out hundreds of thousands or even millions of people's power, you're not going to be limited. all you have to do is have an internet connection somewhere, and then you're back up and running. So if there's a hurricane and there's an evacuation or something like that, and you have to go 150 miles away to stay at a hotel or a relative's house, you can still get in the system and work, and it's just as secure as it would be if you're sitting at your desk. Third-party scans and penetration tests. Do you have anybody currently with your on-site software regularly performing attacks on your software to see if they can get in? So some of these, they call them white knights. So you have the ability to get in there and are they currently doing that with your system? I know a lot of IT departments are progressing in this area, and they're doing things like they're sending out these emails to try to catch you. Are you going to click this or download this when you shouldn't? And then we can use that as training exercises, sure. But are they regularly doing this every single day? Are they continuously monitoring that? So you don't have that problem. Another thing is, and this next comment, sometimes it'll scare people until they think about it. You can't personally access the database. So when you save the data, it goes into a database, and without, yes, you can get to it. Let's say, for example, if you need to download the data, but you can't physically access that database system to change, hold hostage, anything like that. So the issues that we see popping up all over the country that deals with ransomware, these are people who have on-site hosted type of platform where someone had access to the database, and therefore someone was able to get in and hold that information hostage. With a cloud ERP solution or Office 365, that's not the case. Sure, you got to protect your passwords. That's a given. So if I have the ability to enter a bill in my ERP solution and someone steals my password, they're going to have the ability to go into the system and enter a bill too, assuming they know how. If they're smart enough to steal my password, they're probably smart enough to do that. But as a general rule, as long as the initial point of access is secure, there is your username and your password, then you're good to go there. And there's lots of good tools and resources for that, such as regularly changing your passwords. There's password managers. I love LastPass. I'm not getting paid by LastPass, but I tell you, I love it. I can tell LastPass I need a 16-character password that has no repeated numbers or letters, has X number of capital, X number of lowercase, and X number of special characters. I'm never going to memorize that password, but LastPass will do it for me. So anytime, anywhere I'm on a device, I go to log in, I'm not going to have to remember that really long, complicated password. So yes, you can definitely secure it far better than what we can do on site. They have things like two-factor authentication and SAML. There's built-in audit logs so that you can see who's doing what. All of that comes naturally with cloud-based software. That's why more people are kind of moving in this direction. That's why Gatsby is really addressing that. Tom, do you have anything you wanted to add on the security?
That's my favorite part is the team with, I don't know, really any cloud software is they're paying these hackers, thousands of dollars to try to get into it because it only takes one time to get through to make a huge difference. And we see that both from on-premise software, but also just like on a daily life as well. We did have a question that came through from Dana as well about low internet connectivity for like bandwidth and such. I'm not sure if you have that technical answer, but I know it's not a huge concern in that regard. But if you want to expand on that, Chris, that'd be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So, real quick, just kind of show of hands before I get to that question. Anybody where you've worked at, you've had a data breach or someone's gotten into your system? Yeah, look at those numbers. So about, almost 10% of you have said yes. And I've said that as well. So I think we're in good shape there. So Dana, your question about low internet connectivity or bandwidth, yes, you're going to be limited to your access to the internet. Absolutely. That doesn't change. So the faster your internet, the better it's going to be. Right now, I've been working from home now for 7 months. I've had 1 hour in the office in the last 7 months. So I've been here, and I'm actually hardwired. I've got fiber, 1 gigabit speed, and I've wired. I'm not even using Wi-Fi at my desk because I love that fast, robust speed. Yesterday, on my 3 monitors, I had my middle big 2 monitors up and working, and then on my 3rd monitor, I was playing the Braves game at 2 o'clock and listening and catching the highlights of that while I was working, and didn't miss a beat. So yes, the faster your internet, the faster you're going to be able to work. But remember, the only thing you're doing is sending the data back and forth. You're not actually running the program on your internet. So let's say you've got to enter a vendor bill, and there's things like the date and the vendor name and that sort of thing. You're entering that into the fields, and then you're hitting the save button. It's not like you're actually running the program over your internet connection. You're only sending the data changes back and forth. So don't think you have to have high speed. Now, is a 26K modem going to help you? No, you're probably going to notice some issues there with a page loading if that's the case. But most of us have at least some sort of high-speed internet, and you're not gonna notice an issue there. Another thing I really like about the cloud computing is those hot backups. I said before, you've got those 3 data sites. They're all saving your data at the same time, so you never have to worry about your system going down. When I was working in Dunwoody, I guess it's been about 1.5 years ago. I was working, and internally, our internet went down at the office. And what I found really fascinating and a little troubling is just how much I could not do without internet access. We couldn't access our finance software that was on site because it ran through our network. So you want to definitely look at your internet reliability, but I can tell you that problem doesn't exist in a vacuum with cloud software. That's no matter what kind of software you're using, you're going to want some good internet activity. Now, Jamer Jama asked a question: what about open records requests on a personal device? Well, again, good solution, good example here of why cloud computing is so critical and important is the data is not on your personal device. The data is in the cloud. You're simply typing in a web address to get to that data. So there's nothing that you're storing or maintaining on your personal device that would be subject to open records because you don't have any actual records on your device. The audit log, which is kept in the software programs, is going to show who did what, when, and where. So that's already out there. That's not going to be something that you have to pull off your device. Let's say I'm reviewing vendor bills. I've used that example a few times. I'm in here reviewing vendor bills. The vendor bill is saved in the ERP solution in the cloud. All I'm doing is viewing it. So the record's already there. It's not like someone's going to have to go get your personal device. So great question. Now, I will tell you one thing that we got to kind of think about here. I don't think this is a bad thing, but with the evolution of cloud computing, having more data out there and more information out there does mean that there's more information available from an open record standpoint. So the example I gave way back about a half an hour ago, the city manager, you call the city manager to complain about a citation you got, and he pulls up on your screen, well, I'm looking right here, there's a picture, your grass is 3 foot tall. Well, that's a digital photo that's now subject to the Open Records Act that 20 years ago we didn't bother with. So yeah, there's more out there, but your specific question is, what about open records relating to using my personal device? I think we can put that issue to rest, because you're not actually using your device to run anything. You're simply going to a web address that's going to be performing the software for you. And absolutely, you're welcome there. So we've got a 2-3 minutes left here. I want to launch our last poll here, and kind of look at that. Did you hear something you're interested in? This is a shameless sales plug. I'm not too proud to admit it. Would you like to learn a little bit about cloud ERP or even budgeting software? Does the idea of sipping a drink by the pool while you're approving vendor invoices appeal to you versus sitting at your desk? If you'd like to hear a little bit more about that, I'd love to connect either myself or Tom with you and talk a little bit more about cloud computing. Maybe you just want to implement GASB 96 and you don't have any other software-based IT arrangements, and you can't implement 96 without it, so you want to talk to me about that. So certainly do that. And David, while the polling question's still up, I'm just going to skip slides here and show you, as I said at the beginning, I've got a lot more slides that kind of talk about some practical implementation tips to keep in mind, how it impacts your assets and liabilities. Here are some of the exceptions to keep in mind, gathering data, some of the challenges. Here's an example of calculating the implicit rate of the agreement, how much is the liability, et cetera. So all this is in your bonus material. And I certainly welcome you to download that and keep it in mind. I think most of you on this call know me from over the years, and you have access to reaching out to me. But also, if you'll notice in the chat box, Tom has put his contact information in there as well. So with that, Tom, I think we've answered most of the questions as we went through. But certainly want to give everybody 90 seconds if you've got any more questions. Otherwise, I will thank you for your time and your attention this last 75 minutes.
Yeah, Chris, I think just as we're kind of going through, and if any questions pop up, please do. But the biggest thing with the ransomware attacks, I think that's probably the #1 priority for a lot of organizations and jurisdictions moving into this year. Then 2020 happened, and we've all kind of taken a curveball here. But just to reiterate what you said, if they steal your email address and your password, they can access information. They're not going to be able to hold it hostage.
Yes.
That's the biggest thing that's going to be the difference maker. So you can still operate on a regular basis here. They can't actually hold it hostage, which is why cities are paying hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to get access back. So I appreciate you walking through that as well.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks everyone. John, David, I'll turn it back to you guys for our exhibitor hall giveaway.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Tom. Great job. So yes, we do have a giveaway, as Chris just stated. So it's a $50 gift card opportunity. So here's the question, what is the phone number listed in the Bingham Arbitrage Rebate business description? So the fourth correct answer to email ggfoa1985@gmail.com and put Bingham in the subject line wins the gift card.
So do not put your answer in the chat box, please. This is an email response, right? Don't give away answers for free in that chat. You're going to send that response to the
We shouldn't have to post, Dave, at this point in the chat, the link to the exhibitor page, should we? That should be saved in your favorites. That alone with sponsors. All right.
All right. Well, John, I'm looking at my schedule here, and it looks like we're getting ready to go on a lunch break here till 12:50, if I'm correct. So we're going to reconvene virtually at 12:50. So had some great sessions so far. Looking forward to some great sessions this afternoon. We'll see everybody back at 12:50. Thanks very much.